Some places aren't abandoned because they're unsafe. They're abandoned because something happened there more than once. Not rumors, not folklore, not stories invented to scare tourists. Real violence, real collapse, and events so closely linked on the same ground that people stopped calling it coincidence. In Japan, there are locations where tragedy didn't end with a single moment. It returned, sometimes years apart, sometimes in different forms, but always leaving behind the same realization that whatever happened once could happen again. And when that pattern became impossible to ignore, the response wasn't restoration. The buildings were left behind, not to decay, not to be remembered, but to be avoided. We tend to think of haunted places as the aftermath of a single tragedy. One violent act, one broken life, one ghost tied to a moment that never healed. That idea is comforting, because it suggests horror has a clear beginning and a clear end. But some places refuse to work that way. What happens when the land itself becomes saturated? Not with one act of suffering, but with repeated human failure, unchecked ambition, and profound betrayal layered over time. In Japan, there are locations where history did not simply move on, where collapse followed collapse, where violence surfaced, faded, and then returned years later on the same ground. Tonight, we're not exploring haunted buildings. We're examining places where walking away became the only acceptable response, where abandonment was not neglect, but a decision. These aren't stories about ghosts lingering in empty rooms. They're about places that were left behind on purpose. To understand why Doryodo Temple was ultimately abandoned, you have to look at what it was before it became a place people avoided. Established in 1874, the temple once stood as a quiet but vital stop along the old Silk Road route connecting Yokohama to Hachijo-ji. For decades, it served travelers moving between the growing city and the mountains beyond, offering rest, water, and a moment of calm. It was never meant to be isolated. It was meant to be passed through, relied upon, and returned to. But progress has a way of leaving certain places behind. As railways expanded and travel routes shifted, fewer people took the old roads that passed the temple. The paths grew quieter, the surrounding area thinned. By the mid-20th century, Doryodo Temple was no longer a crossroads, but a remnant, maintained by habit rather than necessity, watched over by a single elderly caretaker long after the world around it had moved on. In 1963, that quiet isolation was violently broken. An 82-year-old woman who had cared for the temple grounds for years, its last remaining guardian, was murdered during a robbery. Her life was taken for a small amount of cash, inside a place once defined by refuge and safety. There was nothing symbolic or ritualistic about the crime. That was what made it so disturbing. A space built for rest had become a place where someone died alone, for nothing. Locals would later describe this as the moment the temple changed, not structurally, but spiritually, as if something essential had been damaged and could not be repaired. If the murder of the caretaker marked the first stain on the land surrounding Doryodo Temple, it would not be the last. What unsettled the community was not only the violence itself, but the silence that followed, and how easily the area seemed to absorb it. Years passed. The temple continued to fade, and then, in 1973, the same stretch of land became the final witness to a second, far more devastating act of violence. That year, the body of a young university student was discovered in the forested area within 2 kilometers of the temple ruins. As police investigated, a horrifying truth emerged. The The student had been involved in a secret relationship with her married professor. When she became pregnant, the situation threatened to expose the affair and destroy his career. His response was catastrophic. He murdered the student to conceal the truth, then returned home and killed his wife and children before taking his own life. What shocked investigators was not only the scale of the violence, but its proximity. Another eruption of desperation and betrayal unfolding on ground that had already been marked once before. Two women, their lives taken 10 years apart, in different circumstances but on the same troubled land. One was an elderly caretaker whose devotion ended in senseless violence. The other was a young woman whose future was erased by betrayal. After the second tragedy, Doryodo Temple did not recover. It was eventually demolished in the mid-1980s, leaving only its foundations behind in what is now a quiet forested park. But as locals will tell you, removing the structure did not remove the weight. Whatever had settled there did not leave with the building. It remained, unmarked, unacknowledged, and deliberately avoided. Not all cursed places are born from sudden violence. Some emerge slowly, through neglect, arrogance, and the quiet collapse of human ambition. On the volcanic island of Hachijo-jima, south of Tokyo, the remains of the Hachijo Royal Hotel stand as one of the clearest examples of that kind of failure. It was not a place people fled in panic. It was a place that simply stopped being defended. When construction began in the early 1960s, the hotel was envisioned as a symbol of Japan's post-war resurgence. Designed in an extravagant European style inspired by French Baroque architecture, it was promoted as a luxurious retreat that would transform the island into the Hawaii of Japan. At its height, the Hachijo Royal Hotel was the largest hotel in the country, drawing honeymooners, tour groups, and vacationers eager for a taste of exotic escape without leaving the nation. For a brief time, the illusion held. Guests arrived in waves. The halls were filled with music, movement, and excess. But the success was fragile. As international travel became cheaper and more accessible, domestic tourism declined. Travelers no longer wanted an imitation of paradise when the real thing was only a flight away. The hotel attempted to survive through repeated rebranding and ownership changes, but the decline was steady and irreversible. By 2006, the doors were closed for good. What remains is not a crime scene, but a monument to abandonment. The island's humid tropical climate accelerated the building's decay at a brutal pace. Mold crept across once polished walls. Vines forced their way through broken windows. Grand staircases now lead into darkness. Banquet halls sit empty, their scale intact, but their purpose erased. Nature did not reclaim the building gently. It overtook it, room by room, as if erasing a mistake. Visitors who enter the hotel today often describe a suffocating atmosphere rather than overt paranormal activity. The silence inside the massive structure feels deliberate, unnatural for a place built to host thousands. Footsteps echo too loudly. Corridors stretch on longer than expected. There is a persistent sensation of being observed, not by something present, but by the absence of anything that should be there. The haunting here is not emotional, it is existential. This is what failure looks like when it is allowed to rot in place. Unlike Doryodo Temple, there was no single moment when the Hachijo Royal Hotel crossed a line. There was no crime that forced its closure. Instead, it was abandoned through indifference, left standing as a warning frozen in concrete. It exists as proof that some places become cursed, not through violence, but through unchecked ambition and the refusal to accept when a dream has already died. But documented history only explains part of the pattern. Some places in Japan are feared not for what can be proven, but for what people insist is still waiting. Their stories are not preserved in archives or police records. They are passed quietly, in warnings rather than explanations, among people who have learned that certain locations are better left unnamed. Kamome Manor exists in that space, not as a confirmed ruin, but as a recurring absence in the landscape of Japanese urban legends. Unlike Doryodo Temple or the Hachijo Royal Hotel, Kamome Manor does not exist cleanly on any map. There are no definitive blueprints, no agreed-upon ownership records, no single location that can be pointed to with certainty. Accounts of what the building once was vary widely. Some describe it as an old coastal inn. Others claim it was a tuberculosis sanatorium, a place associated with slow, lingering death. Still others insist it was a care home for the elderly, marked by neglect and abuse. The details never align. What does remain consistent is the outcome. Whatever the building once was, people stopped entering it. This lack of a fixed history does not weaken the legend. It strengthens it. Kamome Manor becomes a kind of archetype, a container into which fear can be poured without resistance. The absence of a single truth allows the story to persist, reshaping itself to match the anxieties of whoever encounters it. It is less a place than a pattern, one that feels immediately recognizable even when its details change. The most enduring story associated with Kamome Manor involves a psychic hired to cleanse the property. According to the account, the cleansing began routinely. The psychic and his assistants moved through the building room by room, encountering resistance, but nothing they could not manage. That changed when they reached the basement. There, the psychic reportedly stopped without explanation. His demeanor shifted. He refused to descend any further. When pressed, he spoke only 2 words before leaving the building entirely. "It's angry." He did not return. Within days, the psychic reportedly developed a sudden, violent fever of unknown origin. He became delirious, incoherent, unable to explain what he had encountered. Within a week, he was dead. No definitive cause was ever released. Among skeptics, the story is dismissed as coincidence or exaggeration. Among urban explorers, it is remembered for its restraint. The legend does not describe a battle or an attack. It describes a warning that was ignored too late. In nearly every version of the story, the basement remains the focal point. Those who claim to have entered it describe a rapid and unnatural rise in temperature, as if heat were radiating outward from the walls themselves. This is often followed by nausea, dizziness, and a powerful sense of disorientation. Some report hearing a child's voice, not crying or calling for help, but speaking calmly, as if reciting something memorized. Deep within the basement is said to be a metal door, locked and wrapped in heavy chains. Witnesses insist the door is warm to the touch, hot enough to blister the skin, as though the heat comes from the other side. Whether Kamome Manor exists as a single physical structure is ultimately beside the point. What matters is how consistently the story behaves. Like Doryodo Temple, it centers on repetition, the idea that something returns rather than fades. Like the Hachijo Royal Hotel, it represents something unresolved, sealed off instead of confronted. Kamome Manor is remembered not as a ruin to be explored, but as a boundary. A place people claim to find, approach, and then choose not to enter. Taken together, these places force an uncomfortable question. Not whether ghosts exist, or whether curses are real, but whether human experience can permanently alter a location. Doryodo Temple shows how violence can stain the ground itself, leaving behind a grief that never resolves. The Hachijo Royal Hotel demonstrates a quieter corruption, how unchecked ambition and failure can rot a place from the inside until it becomes unbearable to occupy. Kamome Manor, whether it exists as a single building or as a shared legend, suggests something even more unsettling. That belief itself can turn a location into a boundary that people instinctively refuse to cross. In each case, the response was the same. The buildings were not destroyed immediately. They were not cleansed. They were not reclaimed. They were left behind. Not because they were forgotten, but because returning felt wrong. Over time, that absence became part of the landscape, an unspoken acknowledgement that some places are not meant to be confronted, studied, or corrected. Perhaps the most disturbing realization is this: none of these places needed a single defining moment to become cursed. They became that way through accumulation, through repetition, neglect, and the refusal to intervene once the damage had already begun. When enough harm settles into one place, leaving may feel like the only responsible choice. And so the ruins remain, quiet, unmarked, avoided. Not as warnings posted on signs, but as lessons preserved in absence, reminders that some doors were closed not out of fear, but out of recognition. And these places in Japan aren't unique. Across the world, there are locations shaped by the same pattern. Places abandoned not because they collapsed, but because confronting what happened there became too difficult. In our next investigation, we'll follow that pattern beyond Japan, to places where history was buried deliberately and never fully stayed buried. If these stories feel familiar, it's because every culture has places like this. Locations shaped by history, failure, and belief, where walking away became the safest option. Horror across borders exists to explore those patterns, not as entertainment alone, but as a way of understanding why certain places across the world feel wrong, long after they've been abandoned. If you want to continue examining these boundaries, the ruins, legends, and histories people quietly avoid, consider subscribing. New stories are released regularly, each one uncovering a place where something was left unresolved. Because some locations don't need ghosts to be terrifying. They only need a past that refuses to stay buried.